Hello and welcome to Book of the Mouse Club, episode number 17, Thursday, February 28th, 2019.
Morning, monsieur.
Where are you off to?
The bookshop. I just finished the most wonderful story about a beanstalk and an ogre and...
That's nice. Marie! The baguettes! Hurry up!
I'm sorry, but how can one possibly pay attention to a book with no pictures in it?
My dear child, there are a great many good books in this world without pictures.
I almost bounced clear out of the book. Some bouncing, huh?
Come home or make myself known.
J. Thaddeus Turtle, Esquire. Have you never met him? You will find his story in this delightful little book, The Wind and the Willows.
I've come to return the book I borrowed.
Finished already?
Oh, I couldn't put it down. Have you got anything new?
Welcome back. I'm your host, Courtney, and I'm joined once again by my lovely co-host, Emily, who I had the pleasure of seeing here in the most magical place on earth very recently.
Hey, listeners. Hey, Courtney. It's so great to be back on the podcast, but I am sad that you and I are not together anymore. I'm back north in Maryland.
But that's why we have this, to stay in touch. And today we are also joined by a special guest, Andrew Kiste, the author of A Historical Tour of Walt Disney World. Books can often be a window to the past, and this one is no exception. Its unique approach to a Disney tour is to filter it through the lens of historical fact, aided by Andrew's rich background on the subject, which he literally teaches to his high school students. Welcome, Andrew.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hey, Andrew, we're so happy to have you. And as a fellow high school history teacher, I'm really excited to have you on our show. But before we get into the book, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your relationship with Disney?
Yeah, so like you said, I'm a high school history teacher in Greensboro, North Carolina. I've always been somebody who's really enjoyed writing. From elementary school onward, it's always been a passion of mine to write. And I've always been really interested with history. I started visiting Walt Disney World from a very young age, probably 2 or 3 years old, so back in the early 90s. And it was always something that my family and I did, every other year or so, going down to Orlando. And while we were there, I kind of would dive into the fantasy worlds that Walt Disney World has to offer. And as I became older, started to appreciate more the details that Imagineers had put into the parks.
That's awesome. I know we're very similar Disney fans as well. It really is those details that make all the difference. So we read what was a combination of volumes 1 and 2 of your historical tour of Walt Disney World, and you currently have 3 editions of that, right?
That's correct. There's 3 separate editions, and then there's also a combined edition that's on sale at Barnes & Noble.
Yes, that's where we found it. We were picking up some stuff, and we're like, oh, we got 2 books in one. So if you had to sum up kind of your book just in like a little elevator quick pitch for our listeners, how would you describe it?
Yeah, so my book does not necessarily cover the history of Walt Disney World. I don't delve a whole lot into, the process behind the development of attractions at Walt Disney World. Rather, my books focus on the historical backstories. So looking at the historical accuracy of the story that's being portrayed.
Yeah, I found that to be a very unique approach. Like, I feel like a lot of people go into like, this is where it started with Walt, but you're more looking at it through the lens of history itself. What was it that inspired you to kind of approach Disney and write a book in that way?
So it's actually kind of a funny story. I had, when I was in high school, would listen to Disney podcasts on an occasion. And one of the podcasts that I was listening to that was very popular back in the early 2000s was starting a magazine that was based in Orlando dealing with the theme parks. And for their first issue, they put out a request to the listeners for anybody to submit any kind of article to get their magazine off the ground. And so the first article that I ended up writing for this magazine dealt with my experience running at the Walt Disney World Marathon weekend back in 2007. And from there, I just became interested in writing about Disney things. One afternoon, when probably around 2009, I came up with this idea of doing some research about Pirates of the Caribbean. It was always one of my favorite attractions growing up. And I was interested in looking at whether Pirates of the Caribbean was historically accurate or not. So I spent a couple of months doing historical research and writing this long article, only to find out that the magazine was not interested in publishing a 15-page article about the historical accuracy of Pirates of the Caribbean in print.
What?
And so instead, they decided to offer me an opportunity to publish that article on their website, on their blog. And so that's kind of where that was first published. If you fast forward a couple of years, after we had moved down to North Carolina, I was sitting in my office going through my emails, and I saw a really weird email from somebody that I had never received an email before from. And this guy basically said, I read your article on this blog, and I would be really interested in offering you a book deal to kind of dig further into this historical accuracy of Disney attractions. And that was kind of where my relationship with Theme Park Press began, was through that email and through that partnership that I established with the publisher there.
That is really cool because most of the other authors we've talked about, it was kind of the other way around where they had these ideas and they wanted to write a book, so they were looking for a publisher. But on the flip side, a publisher found you, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was really interesting process. And at first it seemed kind of shady. Like, do I trust this guy? Do I not trust this guy? And so after a quick Google search, I realized that one of the other authors that I really enjoyed reading that dealt with Disney topics also published through this publisher. And so I kind of realized it was probably a safe bet to start that relationship.
That's awesome. So what was that relationship like? How did you work with? What was the publishing process? We like asking this to all of our authors. Everyone has such a unique experience with publishing.
Yeah, so Bob over at Theme Park Press, he's an excellent work partner. Him and I have been working together since 2015 on this relationship of getting my books published. He's very open to suggestions. We bounce a lot of ideas off of each other. He's given me an opportunity to have some input on cover art. I've pitched different ideas to him, and he's very honest. I mean, this is his livelihood. This is how he makes his money. And so if I pitch something to him and he's not all that interested in it, he tells me, and I'm not offended by it. But at the same time, he's also very open to suggestions. If I need an additional amount of pages to be able to get my information down on paper, he's willing to work with me on that.
That's great. So as you approached writing the book, you had this great relationship with him, and you've already started all of the pirate stuff. What was your research process like? Did you get to have an excuse to go on a trip to Disney to research it, or were you mostly turning to just different books and resources throughout the internet?
So for my first book, A Historical Tour of Walt Disney World Volume 1, and that book focuses specifically on popular attractions like Pirates of the Caribbean, the Jungle Cruise, Main Street USA, and some other attractions as well. I did not have the opportunity to travel down to Walt Disney World during that research process. And so I really relied on a lot of electronic resources. So my first place that I would visit online was actually YouTube. I would go on YouTube and I would find attraction videos that other guests that had visited had recorded and posted on YouTube. And I always made sure that the videos were recent by looking at the timestamps. So I knew I was getting the most recent version of the attraction. And I would sit and pore over these attraction videos for hours, just looking at the different minute details. And I would pause it and I would rewind it. And, I would take down notes about what it is that I was seeing. Another thing that I would do is I would go on Google Maps Street View. Walt Disney World has Street View and the individual views of the theme parks. So you can literally drop yourself down onto the middle of Main Street USA and get a 360-degree view of what it looks like from the inside of the park. And so I kind of virtually placed myself at Walt Disney World as I would conduct the research of the parks and the details of the attractions. But I also have a research background. When I was in college, I worked at the university library as a research assistant. And so I gained a lot of the skills that were required for helping undergraduates and professors do their academic research. And so I became very well versed in online research and digital research and using databases to find the information I needed to kind of apply to these books that I was researching for.
That's really awesome. So before we move out of research, as a history fan and teacher myself, I want to know, did you find anything fun in your research that you really enjoyed but did not make it into the book?
Not really. I mean, it was kind of an interesting process of just censorship in general. Like, I love Walt Disney World, and I'm going to be honest about the stuff that I'm writing about, but at the same time, I don't want to completely disparage this company and this vacation destination that I love. So, for example, in my most recent historical tour of Walt Disney World book, Volume 3, I spend a chapter on the Port Orleans resorts. And one thing that's absent in the Port Orleans resorts is American slavery during the 1800s. The resorts are specifically focused on the cotton industry during the late 1800s, but yet there's no evidence of slavery there. And so it was not so much, what I found that I didn't include, but it was more what I didn't find as I was doing my research of the Walt Disney World attractions that I wasn't able to talk about, things that Disney kind of censored themselves to make things more guest friendly.
We're actually going to cycle back to what you think about those interpretations when we talk about the book. But Courtney, you had a comment?
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, I loved hearing about your process for like watching the YouTube videos and going in Google Maps. I mean, I like to watch those videos in my spare time just for fun, but the fact that you applied it to your research is really unique. We haven't heard anyone mention that before. But I'd also love to know just about your writing process, about like how much time did it take to write? Did you set aside like, oh, this is when I'm going to get it done, or did it come very naturally? I mean, we both come from the humanities in college. I know there's some times where my papers were easy and others where I was like, oh, this William Faulkner paper.
So, I mean, it kind of came and went in waves. I mean, there would be times where I would just sit down and knock out, 5 or 6 pages at a time. And then there would be times where I would sit and work for 2.5 hours and be lucky to finish one single page. I'm a high school history teacher, so my school year is very, very busy, and the summer is kind of dedicated to spending time with my family and traveling back to Michigan, which is where my extended family is. And so, I kind of would find time to work on my books, anytime I had a spare moment, whether it was after my kids went to bed or, if my wife took them to a doctor's appointment, I might sit at home for an hour and work on some of that stuff. Or, even during my planning period when I would be at school, there would be times where, I would be eating my lunch and I would be watching attraction videos on YouTube or reading a historical article with a highlighter in my hand, marking things up before the kids came back from lunch. So it just kind of depended on, the time. I didn't have the luxury of just setting aside, 5 hours to sit and write. So I just kind of made it work when I could.
That's so amazing to me because as a teacher also, I'm just amazed that in 4 years between 2015 and now, you've written 3 volumes and you're already working on another project. So I'm just amazed at how you've been able to balance teaching your family and also writing multiple books.
Yeah, me too. I mean, kind of looking at these were huge undertakings. Back in 2015, there was a period of time where I was out of work for a few months because I was ill. And so I got a lot of work done on Volume 2 during that time. But for Volume 1 and Volume 3, I just kind of fit it in where I had an opportunity to write. So,
what does your students think about you as a Disney author?
So they kind of go through, it's almost like phases of grief for them. At first when they find out, they're kind of, disbelieving, like, oh my gosh, my teacher is such a nerd and I'm so embarrassed by him. And they kind of go through this phase where, they kind of joke about it and they'll make comments about Disney just to get me all riled up. And then they'll go through, the phase of where they finally accept, okay, I've got this teacher and, we don't really talk about it, but he's an author. And then they get to this point where, oh, this is so cool. And they actually start embracing the love for Disney. I mean, I spend class time, as a history teacher, when the kids are working, I put on Disney background music, so they start listening to music from around the parks that correlates with what we're studying. I even had one time where one of my advanced placement classes decided that rather than taking a final exam, they wanted to create a Disney park of their own based on a specific historical period. And so they made their own resorts and their own attractions and cast member costumes. And so, by the end of the year, it's not like I'm trying to indoctrinate the students, but they kind of embrace it through my own passion.
That's a project I'd love to work on. That sounds so fun.
You can't see my face right now, but I've just been like, oh, like mouthing, oh my God, like that's awesome.
Emily's going to steal some ideas for her class.
Oh, so cool.
I can email you stuff. That's
My kids, I only tell a few that I used to work in Walt Disney World, or like a lot of them know, but they don't know the roles I've had in Walt Disney World, working in the resort. So I haven't quite had the same experience you have, but that's so cool. I like how you describe their stages. It's kind of funny. And high school kids are like that. They're very fickle.
Yes.
Before we dive into the book itself, I know we've kind of been talking about the process. I'd like to talk about the cover art. Our listeners, if you haven't looked it up, we're looking at the combined volume 1 and 2, and it reminds me a little bit of kind of when you're entering Walt Disney World or Disneyland, and there's the attraction posters of what's to come. So on this edition, it has little silhouettes for Jungle Cruise, Spaceship Earth, Country Bear Jamboree, Tomorrowland, Crystal Palace, Pirates of the Caribbean, and Main Street USA, all of which are talked about in these volumes. Could you speak to the cover art or who you worked with for that?
Yeah, so the publisher kind of contracted out the cover art through an artist. And I didn't really have any interaction with the artist myself. This was all something that was handled by the publisher. But, the publisher being so easy to work with, he would always send me the cover art and say, what do you think about this? We want, because they're part of a series, we want them to all look similar. But one thing that I really like about the cover art is that if you look at the background, it actually is supposed to be reminiscent of the old Disney World and Disneyland ticket books.
Oh, yes.
Colors are the same, and they've kind of got the same similar pattern in the back. And instead of it saying, e-ticket, it says historical tour ticket in the back. So
now that you mentioned that, I was like, oh, yes, that shade of green is the ticket. I think if we had the two editions as separate books, it'd be like, wait, those are the colors. That's awesome.
Yeah. So
that is so cool. Yeah. Now I'm looking at the cover again, and I didn't really look past the silhouettes before, but that is really cool. What a hidden treasure.
Yeah. So and volume 2 is kind of like a sky blue, and then volume 3 is kind of like a salmon orange. And so, they all kind of go together, and it's fun when I put them on my bookshelf here in my office. They all kind of fit nicely together in a tripartite set. So
I know you're working on another project, which I'll talk about later, but are you going to get to 5 volumes to round out the colors? Will the ticket book be complete?
I mean, I've got a Microsoft Word document that's got a whole list of additional attractions that I could be covering. So there could be additional volumes in the future.
Oh, that's exciting. So let's dive into that book. So why do you think telling the history, not just Walt Disney's history, but actual American world history that inspire these attractions is important for park goers?
So context is everything. And working as a high school teacher, I tell my kids all the time, that would be a really awkward statement if I didn't understand the context of what it is that you as a student are talking about. And so, when it comes to Walt Disney World attractions, the average park goers going in, and they're just enjoying floating through, this Caribbean town that's been set on fire by pirates, or they're enjoying, going through a pretend jungle and seeing animatronic animals in Adventureland's Jungle Cruise, but they don't really understand the historical background behind what that is. And so I know, at least for me, I learned a lot of historical fact as I would do my research. It's really given me an opportunity to enrich the park going experience of understanding why Imagineers put that specific detail there, or what is the reference that the father and the Carousel of Progress is making in this specific scene. It just really enhances the experience and makes it more special when you understand what's being described or what's being talked about. And it really helps you to appreciate the effort the Imagineers have put into it when you realize the level of research they had to conduct in order to make it as authentic as possible.
Absolutely. Going off that Jungle Cruise one night, that was really interesting to me, just given that it's not an area of history that I'm as well versed in. And you had to do, I'm sure, a lot of research on imperialism, colonialism, but you're able to concisely summarize that pretty well within 2 pages. What was your approach to condensing it within the book? Did you find yourself sometimes being like, oop, I'm going too far on a tangent, or having to like censor yourself a bit?
As a history teacher and teaching students of all different levels, I've got standard level students, I've got honors level students, and I've got AP level students. You become very good very quickly at kind of summarizing main concepts. I teach world history, so that requires me to teach 5,000 years of world history in the span of 9 months, and so you become very good at summarizing concepts and historical time periods and events, and so if I were to describe to a student what a 19th century European imperialism was, it would only fill maybe a page or 2, whereas there are some authors who have written entire tomes on European imperialism in India alone, 900-page books. And I didn't want to bore the lay reader. I wanted them to get a basic idea of what imperialism was during the 19th century and help them to then understand that so that I could then go on and apply that information to the Jungle Cruise.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it really approachable for me as a reader. I know Emily's a little more well-versed on the history side.
So kind of going back to a comment you made when we were discussing your the publishing process and the writing process, you talked about Port Orleans and how the absence of American slavery. What do you think is Walt Disney World Resort's role, Disney's role in reimagining this history for its attractions and telling these stories? Is it okay that they're censoring, or how should they approach using history to tell their stories?
Well, I think first of all, going all the way back to the early 1950s when, Walt wanted to create a place where families could enjoy time together. His main goal was to entertain people. And as he developed Disneyland, it went from being entertainment to edutainment. He wanted to educate people while entertaining them at the same time. But at the same time, we live in a world that is increasingly politically correct. You're very careful about what you say and how you say things out of fear of offending people. And so, Disney kind of has to water down specific historical things without offending anyone. But at the same time, they want to make sure that everything that they create tells a story and that it's immersive. And so I don't know that they necessarily are setting out to teach specifically about American history, but in order to separate themselves from other theme parks in Central Florida and other theme parks in California and other theme parks across the United States, they pay more of attention to the level of detail, and it really shows.
Yeah, I can agree with that. And I was also thinking about when I was reading your book, so the redhead scene in Pirates of the Caribbean had not changed yet when you had written your first volume. But there was a lot of controversy about changing that scene because of history or not. So I'm curious if you don't mind sharing your perspective. What side of that debate did you fall on?
So I could see both sides. Growing up, going to Walt Disney World as a young kid and riding Pirates of the Caribbean and having fond memories with my parents on Pirates of the Caribbean. Part of me was disappointed that they were changing it. I loved that scene because it came shortly after the waterfall in the dark that I was absolutely terrified of. And it gave me the opportunity to kind of calm down and immerse myself in the story of what was happening in this city in Puerto Rico. And so part of me, when I found out that they were changing the redhead pirate scene, or the redhead auction scene rather, was disappointed because, I'm a nostalgic and a lot of Disney fans are, and we enjoy what it is that we've always had. But looking at it from a historical standpoint, there were women pirates and women pirate captains who were very involved. This was not a male-dominated profession. And so if we're looking at it from the historical perspective, this is something that would have been an appropriate change as well.
Yeah, she looks really cool. Have you seen her in person yet?
I have not.
It's impressive.
Yeah, we had gone, the last time I think we rode Pirates of the Caribbean was probably back in 2011.
Gotcha. So do you have an excuse for another trip as you do more research?
Yeah, so we've been back since 2011, but every time we were there, Pirates was down for refurbishment.
Oh, just timing it. It happens.
Oh, yes.
I know Pirates kind of started it all for you. Do you have a favorite chapter to write?
So if I were to choose my favorite chapter, it would definitely be the Pirates of the Caribbean chapter.
I figured a little bit.
Yeah. So, just from the fondness of growing up with that attraction, it was always one of my top favorites, the other top favorite kind of being the Haunted Mansion. So, looking at it from that perspective, but also it was the one that kind of gave me my chance. It was the one that kind of helped me fulfill my dream of becoming a writer, because that was the article that the publisher had read that had caught his attention. But also it was the one that I was writing for fun. I wasn't writing it for a book. And so I was able to pour myself, head over tails into the minute details of the attraction.
Now, I'm curious, did that evolve from your original post? You said it ended up being about 15 pages. Like, how much changed from when you started that one?
So for the most part, I did get permission from the publisher of the magazine who had posted my article on the blog. For the most part, it was just copy pasted off of the blog. I had a few additions and a few grammatical changes to kind of polish things up since it was going to press. But for the most part, it's pretty original to the article that I had written for the blog back in 2013.
Cool. I'm glad you were able to keep so much, but it was one of my favorite chapters. I also really greatly enjoyed actually the Storybook Circus chapter. I was really happy in the introduction of Storybook Circus. You mentioned Water for Elephants, which is one of my favorite books, one of my favorite fiction books of all time. And it's always just been a little sad to me that the American circus really doesn't exist anymore. So I was really happy to read a chapter where that history came together, but that, a little piece of it still lives on in Walt Disney World.
Yeah, and that was a really interesting chapter to kind of research. It's at first glance, you don't really think about it as a historical or a historically based area of Walt Disney World. You just think to yourself as you're entering that land, oh, I'm just hanging out in the circus with Dumbo and going into this huge tent that's supposed to be a story. You don't really think about it as a historical land until you really start digging into it and thinking about the golden age of the circus. Dumbo, the film, took place in the 1940s. It was released during the 1940s. That's part of the reason why it was such a short film, was because most of the Disney animators were either producing propaganda for the U.S. military, or they were off fighting the war themselves. And so, just doing the research for the Storybook Circus chapter was really interesting, because I was able to delve into the history of the circus, but also the backstory of how Disney acquired Dumbo and how that story all came together.
Courtney, do you have a favorite chapter?
I did. I feel like it's not going to be what you expect. So if you've listened to the show before, I did my Disney College program at Space Mountain. So I, of course, appreciated the Tomorrowland part. But my favorite was actually the Country Bear Jamboree.
Really?
I felt like I really learned a lot in there. Andrew, you did a great job in that chapter, because I had heard of the Mineral King ski resort plan, and just New Country Bears was tied to that, but I really appreciated the detail that you went into in that chapter, just regarding the history of it, kind of why it ended up not happening, some of the environmental battles there, but then also just going into the music. My boyfriend Doug and I love the Country Bears, unironically, and we made a playlist once of the songs that are in there. So it was great to hear more about the history, and that they were the real songs from different artists, who some of them even provided the voice of the bears.
Yeah, it was really interesting finding that out. I had always assumed that they were just songs that were written by WED, and then come to find out they were actual songs. And I was actually very pleasantly surprised. I was visiting Disneyland a few years ago, and my wife and daughter and we ate at the Smoke Jumpers Grill over at California Adventure. And we were sitting there, and I was listening to the background music, and I thought that the music that was playing seemed awful familiar, but I couldn't place what it was. Mm-hmm. So I had come home and was listening to the playlist on YouTube and realized that it was actually the songs performed by the original artist from the Country Bear Jamboree that was playing in the background loop at the Smoke Jumpers Grill.
Yeah, there's some good songs. They're worth looking up. It was a fun little iPod mix playlist for us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll say I learned a lot from the chapter also, because even though I've been to the attraction, I have not given it that much thought. But Courtney, I really thought I was going to peg you for Spaceship Earth as your fave.
I do love Spaceship Earth, but I feel like Country Bear was more uncharted territory for me.
Yeah, same as I thought about Storybook Circus. Lots of really cool stuff in here. Spaceship Earth was a cool chapter.
Oh yeah, I mean there's so much history, literally.
Yeah, quite literally. Was that your bread and butter there, Andrew, writing about Spaceship Earth?
Yeah, I mean, Spaceship Earth, at Epcot, it's always the very first and the very last attraction that my wife and I visit when we go to Epcot. And so just kind of digging through, scene by scene, okay, who were the Phoenicians and why are they important? And, did they, that question that all Disney fans ask themselves, did the Phoenicians invent the original alphabet? And should we really be thanking the Phoenicians? And looking at, did monks really toil endlessly in the abbeys copying down different scripts, and what happened at the Library of Alexandria? It's just very, very interesting to kind of understand the connections, the historical connections across world history. And likewise, kind of realizing how little history is actually represented. They jump from the Renaissance to the Industrial Revolution to, the 20th century, all in the span of about 30 feet within the attraction. So it was just kind of interesting to realize what the Imagineers had chosen to leave out.
So since they skip so much history, what's a scene that you would like to see in Spaceship Earth that you think technology and communication-wise should be represented?
Ooh, that's a good question. I haven't ever really thought about that before. I think it would be interesting to just kind of dig through a little bit more, those big montage scenes that you have. You're kind of flowing past the big steam press, and then all of a sudden you've got somebody broadcasting on the radio on the left, and you've got telegraph on the right, and you've got TV, and you've got the women on the telephone whose silhouettes are in the windows. And I think it would be interesting to give each of those an individual scene rather than one big room full of all of these different communication technologies, talking about, the invention of the television and maybe showing, Beatlemania on TV or Elvis Presley on TV only shot from his head up or from his waist up because, Elvis the pelvis was too inappropriate for TV at the time. And just kind of digging into those individually rather than, kind of jumping from the steam press to telecommunications, then all of a sudden to the personal computer.
You're right. Yeah, I don't think I thought about it that much. That is one of my favorite sequences because I love the spaceship, them walking on the moon, watching in their television room because my parents talk about having that experience. Mm-hmm. But you're right. They're on the same side of the wall and they're less than a football field apart of end of the Civil War and 100 years later landing a man on the moon.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk kind of about the different attractions. I know we've hinted a bit, but I noticed because we were reading books 1 and 2 within one physical book, I kind of noticed a shift. Like the first half / volume is tied more around geography. So you talk about Main Street and then Adventureland and the attractions within Adventureland and then Tomorrowland and some attractions within Tomorrowland. But in the second volume, it kind of more ties to this theme of like Americana and keep moving forward through history. And you talk about Casey's Corner, Country Bear Jamboree, Spaceship Earth, Sunset Ranch Market, and Storybook Circus, which are all, spread out throughout. What kind of led to your change in approach there?
So I had never really anticipated on making this a book series. I'd only, my goal, my dream for as long as I can remember was just to get a book published. And I was over the moon at getting volume 1 published. So I took a break. I relaxed and got restless very, very quickly and kind of realized, maybe I could write another book about this. It was doing fairly well on Amazon. I was enjoying the royalties checks that came in every few months. And after talking to my publisher, he recommended, he said to me, these are doing very well. Why don't we go ahead and move on to a second volume and actually make this a series? And so, when I had originally written volume 1, I was writing a book about my favorite attractions and about the ones that immediately jumped out as being history-based, the attractions that were the most popular, things like the Carousel of Progress and Pirates and the Jungle Cruise. And when it came to volume 2, I kind of had to dig a little bit deeper and think, okay, what attractions are historical, but that a lot of guests might not realize are more rich in history than just the cursory glance or the cursory walkthrough. And so I did a little bit more digging and kind of focused on this idea of, moving forward and progressing through history and improving, self-improving and technological improvement throughout world history.
So speaking of these volumes, can you give us a quick summary of what are some of the other attractions that you cover in volume 3?
Yeah, so volume 3 is actually tied around the theme of guests having the opportunity to experience all 300 years of American history in one day on Walt Disney World property. So they can actually start in Fantasyland before the colonists leave Europe and head over to the Americas. And they actually make that transition by Peter Pan's flight underneath where, what's that restaurant? By Haunted Mansion.
Columbia Harbor House.
Yes, so they go below Columbia Harbor House, that eating bridge that's kind of above between Fantasyland and Liberty Square, and they transition then into the American colonies. And then as they move from Liberty Square into Frontierland, they're kind of moving into the 1800s. And then guests can leave the Magic Kingdom and head over to Port Orleans and experience the late 1800s. Before heading over to Pop Century and experiencing the 1900s. And so it kind of gives guests and readers the opportunity to experience American history, both through the experience of the lands of the Magic Kingdom, but also some resorts as well.
That sounds really fun. I definitely want to check that one out. Our intent was to read the first volume, and then we both went to Barnes & Noble, and surprise, we got volumes 1 and 2. So I feel like I need to round it out with that final one, because that sounds like a fun way to approach it as well. Now that you've written 3 volumes, do you have an appreciation for an attraction that you didn't have before?
So, I really enjoyed doing the research for the Sunset Ranch Market, which is on Sunset Boulevard over at Hollywood Studios. And it's the open air food court that's kind of on the left side of the road if you're heading towards Tower of Terror and Rock and Roller Coaster. And it was just really kind of interesting. I didn't know much about California. I had never been to California before when I had written volume 2. And so just kind of doing the research, realizing that the architecture of the Sunset Ranch Market is actually based on a farmer's market in Los Angeles, and kind of looking at, okay, what are the references that are being made by the different food locations at the Sunset Ranch Market? What is Catalina Eddie's? What is that referring to? How is this tied into the overall theme of the land of Hollywood Studios? Sunset Ranch or Sunset Boulevard is focused on, World War II America. And so kind of realizing that this is a farmer's market that's selling food during World War II. And there's actually a little vignette in the back of Sunset Ranch Market where there's a victory garden complete with some World War II memorabilia, which is really cool to see as well.
Emily, was that one of your favorite chapters given your research?
I did really enjoy that. And again, that's also one I don't really eat there that often when I'm in Hollywood Studios, so I only really walked past it, so I never really took it in. So now I think on my next trip, I really need to walk through the walk through the eating area and take in some more of those details, because I really didn't know much about it, let alone some of the details you pointed out. I didn't even know were there.
Yeah. It's really interesting.
I do love the World War II era. My favorite time period is 1900 to 1945. So I really should check that back out. So Courtney, maybe on my next trip, we need to add Sunset Ridge Market to our eating list.
Yeah, I like that place.
I've never eaten there.
Yeah, it's nice. They have mobile order, so that's always good.
Convenient. So heading into some closing questions, just some general ideas. Would you say your love of history, Andrew, influenced your love of Disney, or Disney influenced your love of history?
I would say they kind of both influenced each other. Kind of growing up as a kid, I wasn't really in tuned with history. It wasn't necessarily something that my family embraced. I mean, we would travel to Colonial Williamsburg, but that was the most historical place that we ever really went to. My family is more of a sports family, so we would go and see the Detroit Tigers play. But going to the Walt Disney World parks and kind of immersing myself in the different historical locales of the theme parks and the resorts made me interested in researching more about history. And then as I became older and started to understand and appreciate history for what it is, it helped me to appreciate the Disney parks and resorts even more. So it kind of went hand in hand together.
Well, speaking of that research, you have an exciting upcoming project that I know Emily and I cannot wait to see once it's out. Do you want to tease a little bit about that for our listeners?
Yeah, so my wife and I were driving down the highway a few months ago, and we were talking about the 1964 New York World's Fair, and I was teaching her she had never realized that Disney had an influence in the 1964 World's Fair. And so she said to me, well, has anybody ever written a book about that? And I said, well, not to my knowledge. So I came home and I did some research on Amazon and online and found that while some people had mentioned the World's Fair in various Disney books, whether it be a chapter or just a passing reference, nobody had actually tackled the project of actually writing about the relationship between Disney and the New York World's Fair. And so I started the process, visited the Illinois State Archives over the summer and was able to look through many of their papers on their partnership with Disney to create Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln. And what originally started out as being a single volume about the Disney relationship with the 1964 New York World's Fair has evolved into a book series where each book will focus on an individual attraction that Disney created. So the first volume of that series, or the first book in that series, which is due out sometime this spring, will be focusing on the Illinois Pavilion and Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln.
I've really enjoyed following along with little snippets of your research on Twitter. So that's awesome to hear that it'll be more than one and you really get to go in depth with the attractions. I think I'd be excited for the Ford Magic Skyway because I think that's the one I'm not as familiar with, and because it wasn't really brought back to the parks in the same form.
Yeah, and I'm actually, very lucky. I was able to connect with some people that worked for the Illinois Pavilion, and I was able to interview with them and kind of get their own personal stories about what it was to work there. And some of them had actually met Walt himself when he had visited.
Yes.
And I'm actually getting the opportunity to go to the Henry Ford Museum this summer when we visit Michigan, and getting to dig through the Ford archives to learn more about Magic Skyway myself.
That's amazing.
This sounds so cool. And that's how you and I connected on Twitter, was tweeting about archival research. So that's really, really cool. And I can't wait to see what you find now in Ford. That's my mind is blown right now. I'm so excited.
Well, thank you.
So as you're writing this, we always ask this to our authors, but do you have any advice for aspiring authors, aspiring Disney authors?
Yeah, so, you had mentioned earlier that a lot of the authors that you've talked to have sought out publishers themselves rather than being approached by publishers like I was. And that's how I started. I had sent pitches. I'd written some different pieces of fiction, and I had sought out publishers and editors and different people in the writing community myself, and it was incredibly discouraging. I would get rejection letters, and people didn't even really want to look at my manuscript. And I was lucky enough to be given this opportunity where I was approached by a publisher. But the advice that I have for any aspiring writer, whether it's Disney related or not, is just don't give up. This is a passion that you have. This is a dream that you have, and you need to stick with it, because the only person who can make your dreams come true is you.
Oh, that's so touching. We also love to ask our authors, what is your favorite Disney book or Disney resource that you'd like to recommend for our listeners?
So I really enjoy, and I actually have it here in my office, I really enjoy Disney War by James Stewart. It's an excellent look at the crumbling and rebirth of the Walt Disney Company during the late 1980s and early 1990s during the reign of Michael Eisner. And it's just really interesting to kind of look at, how Disney had almost fallen apart and had been sold off to some other companies, and how it kind of was reborn, and how Walt Disney World expanded quite dramatically during the early 1990s.
I haven't read that one, but my boyfriend did, and he absolutely loved it. So it should be on our to-be-read list.
Yes, it's a great book.
Well, next on our to-be-read list, we'll be celebrating Women's History Month in March. Emily, do you want to give a little preview of that?
Sure. So in honor of Women's History, we thought we would celebrate the women behind the magic at the Walt Disney Studios with the very popular Mindy Johnson book, Ink and Paint. I got this for Christmas. This was on my list. I've been waiting to get this book, so I'm really excited to dive into it. So I'm just going to read to you a piece of the inside cover, listeners, so that you have an idea of what we're getting into next month. So in her latest landmark book, Ink and Paint, The Women of Walt Disney's Animation, author Mindy Johnson pulls back the celluloid curtain on the nearly vanished world of ink pens, paintbrushes, pigments, and tea. From the earliest black and white Alice comedies to the advent of caps and digital animation, meet the pioneering women who brought hand-rendered animation stories to vibrant, multicolor life at Walt Disney Studios and beyond. Extensively researched with the full support of the entire Walt Disney Studios archival resources, plus a multitude of private collections, first-hand accounts, newly discovered materials, and production documentation, as well as never-seen-before photography and artwork, this essential volume redefines the collective history of animation.
I'm so excited for this one because it's been on my to-be-read list for like a year. It's quite a massive undertaking, but we have a plan to get it done, and we have to do it in March for Women's History Month. So I think we're going to give ourselves about 3 weeks to get through that one, and we'll have the latest episode to you soon in March. In the meantime, you can keep up with us on social media for Book of the Mouse Club on Twitter and Instagram at Book of the Mouse, or email us with comments or ideas at bookofthemouseclub@gmail.com. Please be sure to leave us a review on iTunes so others can find our podcast and read and listen along with us. If you want to keep up with me, Courtney, I'm on Instagram at GreatGutsby and on Twitter at Courtney_Guth.
And you can follow me, Emily, on Instagram and Twitter at the same handle at Emily_McD.
And Andrew, where can our listeners keep up with you as well?
I'm on Twitter at HistTourWDW. And I also have a personal author website, which is www.KisteTheHistorian.com. Awesome.
It sounds like a lot of resources there as well. We also like to have our authors take us out with a little ending quote. So I'll leave you to it.
Yes. So my ending quote comes from the much-loved attraction Horizons. And that quote is, "If you can dream it, you can do it."
I think that goes right along with that great advice that you gave to our listeners as well. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
And we're super excited about your coming projects. We might have to have you back on the show.
Oh, I would love to do that.
Bye, guys.
See you later, everybody.
Bye.
Book of the Mouse Club has no affiliation with the Walt Disney Company. The views and opinions expressed by hosts and participants are theirs and theirs alone. They do not represent the organizations or companies they happen to work for.